Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gostola, and welcome to this free edition of the Unauthorized Disclosure weekly podcast. I'm pleased to be joined this week by Wanda Bertram, who is a communications strategist with Prison Policy Initiative. In fact, I have a former colleague and good friend, Brian Sonnenstein, who is a policy researcher and works on their briefings. And so this advocacy organization worked on for the last several years a policy for phone justice, prisoner phone justice, that was adopted by the Federal Communications Commission. They slashed the rates for phone calls and in a manner that will benefit people in jails and prisons throughout the United States. It's an important victory, and it's one that is a movement victory. And so I took this time for this recent edition of the show to mark it, celebrate it, and discuss some of the issues that surround prisoners having access to their family members when they are incarcerated. And so, just to give you a few details before we get into this interview, this is a result of the Martha Wright Reed Act, which was inspired by a grandmother who spent hundreds of dollars every month in phone calls to stay in touch with her incarcerated grandson, who for more than 2 decades petitioned the FCC and Congress for relief from these exorbitantly high charges. That's according to the Electronic Privacy Information Center, one of the groups that pushed for these changes. And however, I'd like to credit a group that receives a shout out from Wanda in this conversation. She mentions Worth Rises based in New York. This is a group that is dedicated to dismantling the prison industry and ending the exploitation of those it touches. And their summary of this was that it would improve the well-being and reentry success of incarcerated people, that it would increase the financial stability of millions of Americans with incarcerated family members, and that it will rein in and right-size the prison telecom industry that has preyed on incarcerated people and their loved ones, and that it'll reverse the mass surveillance project that correctional agencies and their industry partners have expanded rapidly in recent years. Something that the Electronic Privacy Information Center points out is that it will impose some limits on the biometric surveillance that goes on in facilities. And then we hear from Bianca Tylek, the executive director of Worth Rises, that for far too long, families around the country have struggled to afford to stay connected to their incarcerated loved ones. Too many have gone into debt just to keep in touch or been cut off entirely. Relief is finally on the horizon. We extend enormous gratitude to FCC Chairwoman Jessica Rosen-Workle and the other commissioners for recognizing the toll that predatory communication costs take on incarcerated people, their families, communities, and the public. It's impossible to calculate the magnitude of the impact that this will have on the millions of families with incarcerated loved ones, but we know that we'll save them more than $500 million annually. So that's from the executive director for Worth Rises. So I'm not going to waste any more time, but I do want to ask if this interview is something you appreciate, you want more shows like this, please become a subscriber. Go to patreon.com/unauthorized disclosure, and you can go to the dissenter.org and subscribe there, become a supporter of that newsletter and sign up at just the podcast level, get access to this. If you are a subscriber or a paid member on Patreon, you can get the full episodes of all of these shows. You get them early. We post on Friday. The shows are available exclusively, and then they're made available to everyone on Monday or early in the week, typically. So without any more babbling, without any more rambling from me, we get to this interview from. Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gostola, and welcome to this interview. I'm really pleased to be joined by Wanda Bertram, who is a communications a communication strategist at Prison Policy Initiative. And it's so good to be talking with you. You're joining me today to discuss this news with the Federal Communications Commission that is going to benefit, or if it hasn't already, it will benefit all of the inmates or prisoners in many of these U.S. facilities that rely on jail phone services. So thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me.
I feel like with the overwhelming amount of political news, global news, whatever it might be, uh, this is the kind of development that is a good news development, and it just sort of falls under the radar. Just the natural, the way that the media ecosystem plays out. But I know that you've been working on this for a long time as someone who's a part of Prison Policy Initiative. Could you describe what happened with the FCC and why this is a major victory for a movement that was standing up for, I suppose, the rights of prisoners, or even just trying to defend against abuses against people in jails and prisons throughout the United States?
Yeah, sure. Well, so as some of your listeners might already be aware, people in prison and their families have to pay exorbitant rates for phone calls and for other telecom services like video calls and electronic messaging. Rates that are, are would seem totally alien to us who, for whom the marginal cost of a phone call or a video call like the one we're on right now is zero, right? Back when my colleagues at the Prison Policy Initiative began working on this, phone calls from jails and prisons were often $1 a minute or even more. And over more than a decade of sustained advocacy by people who are directly impacted by this, for the most part, the Federal Communications Commission and some other agencies have taken action to gradually bring these rates down. But the cap still remained pretty high. Uh, and so, what it looked like was, as of 2021, people in jails and prisons were paying, well, if you were in jails, you'd pay a maximum of 21 cents a minute for phone calls. If you're in prison, you would pay a maximum of 14 cents a minute. And something that I want to just like get in there right off the bat is that this is not, these costs are not what prison telecom companies simply have to charge in order to pass through the cost of delivering service, right? These are this is a couple of companies or a handful of really big companies squeezing the maximum amount of money possible out of this captive market, and they have, whenever the FCC has set a cap on how much they can charge, these companies go right up to that limit, except when the facilities that they're negotiating with, for some reason, say not to. And the facilities, the prisons and the jails that are involved also play a huge role in this, because they, for years, have been demanding kickbacks out of the contracts that they strike with these companies. These kickbacks can be, 50% of total revenue or even more, for phone calls, and for video calls and other services, and the this corrupt influence, has had the effect of raising prices. So, it's not just these telecom giants that are benefiting from charging incarcerated people tons of money for phone calls. It's also been jails and prisons themselves pocketing a lot of the money and then using that to pad their own budgets. So this is kind of, I think, on its face, it seems like a very wonky victory, but it's what it comes to is that the FCC is affirming what we and so many incarcerated people and their families have been saying for decades, which is that people who have loved ones in prison should not be the ones paying for the costs of incarceration, by way of paying these exorbitant rates for telecom.
So, what facilities, what jails are? Is it every jail or prison in the United States that will benefit from these price caps? And can you list out what services are we talking about that are being capped by this FCC action?
every single jail and prison will see effects from this ruling, with the exception of the ones that have already, usually because of, again, like strong community advocacy, taken action to lower their own rates. Um, one, one example of this would be New York City, which was the very first local jurisdiction in the country to make jail phone calls free. And when I say free, I mean they're free of charge for incarcerated people and their families. They're paid for out of the general budget, and that just means that the cost of these phone calls is equitably distributed across the public sphere, as it should be, because helping people stay in touch with their families behind bars is a public good. So and at the very least, even if you don't believe it's a public good because it falls within the prison system, you should acknowledge that it is something that shouldn't be imposed on incarcerated people and their families exclusively. So, a strong campaign in New York City led to them making phone calls free, and a few other jurisdictions around the country, actually including I want to say around five to 10 prison systems have done the same thing in the last few years. I want to shout out our friends over at Worth Rises, which have who have worked in many states to pass laws that have led to this. But you asked, what's the impact going to be, for people in those facilities, and what services are covered. The FCC's order covers phone calls, which we sometimes call voice calls. It's our nerdy way of referring to, you can't see the person's face, and also video calls. Um, that's it. Um, there are other telecom services that these companies offer. Electronic messaging is a big one. Services on tablet computers that they provide to incarcerated people are other ones. The FCC has been very cagey over the last 10 to 15 years about what services it has jurisdiction over. And that's not all on the FCC. Like the agency has been sued multiple times by the telecom companies saying you don't have jurisdiction over this, over that. So I think they're reluctant to get into a thorny legal battle with the companies that they can't win. So they've been hesitant to, tread on areas where they or regulate services that they might not be able to regulate. So this only applies to these two types of calls. That said, they are the most common. I think they're, that this represents, a majority of the communications that incarcerated people have with their families. So it's a big deal.
I know that in writing about this development, you brought particular attention for Prison Policy Initiative to the way that there's now a rule on ancillary fees. And
Yes.
can you get into, well, first off, tell people what ancillary fees are, and then what this will mean for people who are in jails or prisons.
Actually, I'm going to usurp your question a little bit and just start by saying what the new rate caps are the FCC has handed down, because I forgot to say that before. The FCC has capped rates for phone and video, or for phone calls, at 6 cents for prisons, and then a little bit more for jails, depending on the size of the jail. And I want to say that to start with because the stuff about ancillary fees makes that kind of important. So for the longest time, people who are, receiving a phone bill for calls they make to or from prisons are uh, seeing not just charges based on the amount of time they spent on the phone, but also these extra, what they call taxes and fees, for things like you made a deposit into your loved one's account. You made a deposit using a credit card, so there's a credit card fee. You made a deposit using MoneyGram. You made a deposit using Western Union. All these have fees attached to them. Ironically, making a phone call without an account attached to it is also something that carries a fee. And the companies have actually done this horrible thing where their phone tree will steer people towards making calls that generate the maximum amount of fee revenue. Um, and they've done this because, in large part, as the Federal Communications Commission over the last 10 years has gradually squeezed them for, saying you can't charge more than this amount. They have looked for other ways to pad their revenue. And one of those ways was just saying, well, this is, we're going to charge you some extra money, not because of the time you spent on the phone. It's not in the permanent rate. It's just this other thing that we have to charge you for, right? And the FCC has tried a couple ways of dealing with this corporate chicanery. And this time, what they did was they just said, you charge whatever fees you want for whatever services you want, but it has to be incorporated into the rate. So it they basically, the new rates, which will be no more than, again, like I said, top 6 cents for prisons, include not just the per minute, the cost of, calls per minute, but also the fees themselves. So that kind of, um, it, it's great in a number of ways, but primarily that's just going to lower the costs for families even more.
Along with this, we have the issue of corporate kickbacks. Right.
Yeah.
And I think this might be kind of like a product of that, or sort of related to it. But in your analysis, you say that it appears that these have been restricted, or in some instances, I suppose they would almost be impossible for these companies to get away with anymore. So can you describe, where this appears, or how this comes into play in the order from the FCC?
Sure. The FCC has banned what they call site commissions, and site commissions are their kind of regulatory word for kickbacks. They've banned them in all forms, past a certain point. Companies can still, within certain guidelines, which I'm sure they'll easily find ways to get around, um, they can still reimburse counties and departments of corrections for up to 2 cents per minute of calling. Um, that's not that much in the grand scheme of things. And again, this has to be built into the rate. So companies are having to squeeze everything, all of this stuff into these much tighter per minute rates now. That said, beyond that, the FCC has said you cannot pay counties a certain amount per minute, as part of your contract agreement. You cannot give them lump sum payments up top. You cannot gift them technology, which is something that happens a lot in video calling agreements. The companies will say, "Hey, we'll set up all this video calling, equipment for you for free, and we'll just make that." What the companies do then is then they raise their video calling rate so that they can offset the costs of that free installation. Um, so that's kind of a perverse dynamic at play. They can't do that anymore. Um, you can't. The FCC says you can't give gifts to counties and departments of corrections anymore, which is like astonishing that this even happens. But it's like present in so many contracts. The news organization The Appeal reported a couple years ago on Florida sheriffs receiving Caribbean cruises in their contracts. And this is all stuff that, sometimes we'll put into our in our more advocacy oriented documents. We've tried to make the argument that, the existence of so many kickback incentives is actually not very good for business. The companies are not excited to offer these things to counties and DOCs, but they compete with other companies that are also offering them. So they get into this arms race, where they're trying to one up each other, and it just leads to it's led to a bunch of like I said, really perverse incentives. They can't do it anymore, which is great news.
So these companies, which companies are we talking about? And are these companies that, for the most part, if you look at what they do in their business, they would have a tough time existing without these jail and or prison contracts?
Yes. For the most part, they're companies that are exclusively dealing within the prison system. The big ones in the space are Securus, GTL, which is now known as Viapath. That name is having a hard time sticking with me. And IC Solutions. So they're the big ones. And yeah, they're focused on prison telecom services and jail telecom services, and they're actually owned by private equity companies, which have are attracted to the prison profiteering because it is quote unquote recession proof. No matter if you're in a recession or you're not, people are going to need to communicate with their loved ones on the outside, and they're going to do it any way they can. Families are going to mortgage their house. They're going to sell their car. They're going to go without groceries or medication so that they can talk to their loved ones. We've seen this for many, many years. Yeah, the companies are going to suffer because of this, which I think is a good thing because profitability has only led to cruelties for people in the system. they will find a way to continue existing, you know, and those that, the ways that they continue existing and continue to profit will probably involve looking for new ways to exploit incarcerated populations. So we're going to remain vigilant about that. Um, and, what, I guess we'll just have to see what happens.
All right, so I'm going to put on screen. This was your work. You were involved in the State of Phone Justice 2022, and I just, before we totally move on from some of these specifics, I want to see. So these rates that we're talking about in this map here, um, those reflect the jails in those states. When you
Hmm.
say what the cap is on pricing, so for example, I'm in Chicago. In Illinois, the average in 2022, you said, was $3.01 according to this. So does that mean it's going to come down to the cap? The is that what the FCC is doing here, or am I
Right.
confused?
Well, so what this graph shows for people who aren't looking at it is the cost of a 15-minute phone call. So this
Oh,
is
right, right,
under.
right. So this would be per minute, adding it up. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, right. So in a state like Illinois, which is charging, I think, pretty close to the legal caps for jails, which was 21 cents a minute, that adds up to a little bit more than $3 for a 15-minute call, which we kind of arbitrarily decided a long time ago is like an average phone call.
Uh-huh.
In actuality, people are spending longer than that on the phone, but whatever. Um, After this ruling, those rates are going to come down so that in jails, in a large jail, I believe the cap is going to be something like 7 cents a minute. In small or really small jails, I think it might go up to 11 or 12 cents a minute. I actually don't have the rates right in front of me. But what that means is that, yeah, for a 15-minute call, that cost is gonna get cut in half. It's gonna be closer to like $1.50.
All right. And then, just because I'm curious, thinking about the way that phone calls work in jails or prisons, there's the price for what we'll just take a 15-minute call would be, and
Yeah.
there's that issue. But don't facilities cap the amount of time that an inmate or a prisoner can stay on the line, or is that not true?
Mhm. Yeah,
Okay.
that no, those yeah, they often do that.
Okay. So along with the cost maybe being too expensive, there's also, okay, I'm not done with my conversation. I'd like to stay on and finish it, but you face the fact that it could be cut off while you're talking to whoever you have on the other end of the line. Because isn't there, like, you usually have, for those who haven't made prison or jail phone calls, there's usually this, like, robotic voice that comes on and, like, lets you know that you're being called by somebody in these facilities.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and we've actually seen this. Many facilities will put a time limit on how long people can spend on the phone or on a video call. Although theoretically, with more jails and prisons moving towards tablet-based telecom services, that may not be as much the case anymore. Tablets, for those that aren't aware, it's nothing like an iPad. It's a very rudimentary piece of hardware that people are able to have in their cells with them. If a jail has a system where people are renting out tablets, then they're probably still going to have a time limit. If it's just everyone in the prison or the jail gets a tablet, then theoretically you could spend just as much time on there as you wanted. Um, but I was going to say we've seen this in action actually in Connecticut, which was the first state Department of Corrections to make phone calls free for incarcerated people. There's still a rule in Connecticut prisons that you can have a maximum of 6 15-minute calls, I think, per day. And if uh, one of the problems with phone services in prisons and jails is just the quality is bad. The connectivity tends to be kind of poor, and so people's calls often get dropped. And what we've heard from people in Connecticut is, well, I go to call my loved one and our call gets dropped, but that still counts as one of my 6 15-minute calls. Uh, it's not like the rates are not the only issue here. Um, I mean, there's also the possibility too that jails and prisons, seeing less of an incentive to provide these services to incarcerated people because they aren't raking in as much money from it, are going to flag in how much they're providing these services to people. So, people in, folks may want to be diligent about that just to make sure that doesn't happen. Um, in their state or their county, and hopefully, I mean, I think that jails and prisons, if they were to do that, might run up against some big legal challenges. So hopefully we won't see that very much.
All right. So I have just a couple more questions and then I'll wrap. But before I let you go, I did want to specifically spend a few minutes on prison tablets, just for the
Yeah,
fact that there, as you've written about, there's a monopolistic quality to some of these contracts. But also, I believe people who are listening to this conversation might be interested in the way in which, and you were getting at it to some degree, but the way these tablets are being used to replace providing certain services, that to
yeah,
me, I think seems fundamental to understanding the place that tablets occupy. Because I just think, as anybody who is following understands, there's a convenience to tablets. People think about that as something that is useful for those who are non-incarcerated, but it might be a little difficult for people to grasp that, like, these tablets, while prisoners might like to have them, are actually being used to supplant and justify the removal of services.
yeah. I mean, there's a few different dynamics at play, with prison tablets, and so I guess to back up first, what these offerings look like typically is, um, a prison telecom company with whom a prisoner jail already has a contractual relationship, maybe to provide phone services, will come in during a round of contracting and say, "Hey, we can offer you something else. We can give you a bunch of tablet computers, and we'll be able to deliver not only phone service, not only video calling service, but also games, movies, music, electronic messaging, all of these things to incarcerated people and their families, and we can generate kickbacks for you for all of these services." um, Granted, it's good for the companies as well because they're kind of starting from scratch when it comes to the commission rates. So they're giving away less of their money for services on prison tablets so far than they were on phone calls. So they're taking home more revenue from that. But what results is, that whole prison systems or jail systems will acquire thousands and thousands of tablet computers that they then pass around to the incarcerated population. Um, it has sometimes been used, like video calling, being used as an excuse to slash in-person visits. It's sometimes been used as an excuse to, defund the law library or the physical library. The prisons will say, "Well, you've got books, you've got ebooks now on your tablet, right? What more do you need?" To justify banning donations of books for the same reason. Um, uh, um, it can justify, and this we've seen this in so many places, the banning of physical mail, um, and uh, and oftentimes also, the tablets go along with this service called mail scanning, where the companies will say, we can scan and make a photocopy or a scan of any physical mail that comes into incarcerated people, and then you don't have to worry about drugs or other contraband coming in through the mail because they'll just get a scan instead. No matter that people who are incarcerated can no longer hold a letter from their loved one, or see like a quality rendition of a photograph. Um, but yeah, I mean, this is tricky for a couple of reasons, because incarcerated people that I and my colleagues have corresponded with say overwhelmingly, we love tablets. It's like it provides connection to the outside world on a level, and maybe, without restrictions such that they hadn't experienced before. It allows people who were previously, going to be cut off from those services, perhaps because they were in solitary, to access them again. People don't want them to go away, but at the same time, the rates that we're seeing people be charged on these devices are truly egregious and reminiscent of what phone calls looked like before advocates got involved. For instance, there's, GTL, now known as Viapath, did this thing where they took a bunch of free books from Project Gutenberg and then redistributed them on the tablets, but made people pay for them. So just making money off of nothing, which is kind of GTL's. That's something that's their strong suit of them. But yeah, it's an unfortunate trend, and I think something that we would like to see state utilities boards, if not the Federal Communications Commission, get involved in. But first, we have to convince them that it's there within their jurisdiction and it's their prerogative.
All right. And one little thing. So if you are in a jail and you have a tablet, I realize that there's a number of facilities that don't have phones anymore in the jail and are using these devices, which I don't know every prisoner would necessarily have, but they're sort of using the quote unquote free tablets to say,
Right.
well, we don't have to manage getting people access to the phones anymore.
Yeah, and that's something that it, kind of on a related note, we're seeing jails that have eliminated in-person visits in favor of video calling, then rebuild their jails. When they rebuild their jails, the new jail doesn't contain any in-person visiting space. So this technology is not only providing this avenue for companies to exploit incarcerated people, it's also actually like changing the physical infrastructure of prisons and jails, which is something where, like, I mean, the bad news is that's horrible. The good news is that this is something that, that's local policy, and that's something that people can actually influence in their jail, in their local jail. They can push back. So, I mean, I'm not going to say any more on that, but
Yeah.
yes, there's a lot of opportunities for mistreatment.
So then my last thing is just to raise a kind of a boogeyman issue that gets thrown around and to acknowledge that there were two commissioners that voted against the price caps. One of them, Ajit Pai, who came from, well, he was original before now, he was the FCC chair under President Donald
Yeah.
Trump's administration. And I noticed that he was, I might have this wrong, but it seemed that he was insisting that a more pressing issue is that there are prisoners who are smuggling cell phones or contraband cell phones into prisons. I'm not really sure what the FCC role would be in doing anything about that. He's probably just fronting
Hmm.
for his corporate interests that he often represents. But this is something that it seems is pretty well exaggerated about the problem of phones being snuck into prisons, though they are. But I mean, what would you say as somebody who looks at policies around phone access and these kinds of things? Like, is this as disruptive to the order of prisons and jails as someone like Ajit Pai would have us believe?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the argument for cracking down on contraband cell phones is that it poses a security threat because people could negotiate criminal activity both either within the prison or in some kind like outside the prison, right? And the news that the mainstream news media loves to play this up by doing an article about and anytime someone orchestrates a crime using a contraband cell phone, it feels like we hear about it on the news. But the what people are getting contraband cell phones for is to contact their families, right? By and large, people need these phones because they can't afford the rates that are charged on the phones that are provided by the prison or the jail. So the irony in what Ajit Pai was saying is that it precisely through strict regulation of these calls and what the companies are doing that you can reduce the demand for contraband phones inside. Um, yeah, unfortunately, if Donald Trump is reelected, we may see him put back in the chairman seat again, which would be really unfortunate because the last time he was there, the basically the FCC had just introduced some one of its first major rounds of caps on phone calls, and the company sued, and Ajit then came into, you know, he was helming the FCC, and he said, "Oh, okay, we're not going to defend ourselves against this lawsuit." So basically, walked back a lot of their regulations. Hopefully, something like that does not happen again. Um, yeah, that's not a very compelling end of the answer.
No,
I'm
and
afraid.
I'd like to wrap up our conversation, but without leaving a loose end. This change that was made by the FCC, these caps, I
Mhm.
suppose we should put the exclamation point on it if this is so, that at any point this can be altered by the FCC, right? Can they at any point they can go back and change the caps for these prices?
Yeah, they could. I think it's slightly less likely that that will happen than that the companies will start to look for ways around the regulations. And if there's a less progressive FCC in place after this coming election, they will not, again, will not defend or won't proactively fight for consumers. Um, and, but I mean, the hopefully the rules are going to go into the Federal Register in the next couple of weeks, which will mean no matter who gets elected president in November, those rules can't be overturned by Congress. So I think they'll be pretty watertight.
Okay, so in your estimation, it would probably be more likely that these exploitative companies would, just say, okay, well, that's settled because there are, a half dozen other ways we haven't explored yet that we could get money out of this system.
Yeah, or they'll launch some kind of legal challenge, to the existing regulations, and and the FCC will lie down and let them win.
Right, because as you say, they're reluctant to go too far
Mhm.
as these regulators. All right, well, Wanda, I really thank you for joining me to have this conversation and discuss this development. And as you said up top, or as we noted, it's a big victory. And then now, for the movement that cares about having this kind of access and allowing prisoner justice to have not notch these victories, that this is the kind of conversation we need to have, and you do the kind of work that is necessary to make sure that we can maintain those gains and not see them fall away as a result of politics. So thank you for joining me.
Oh, well, thank you for having me.
So thank you, Wanda, for being part of the show this week. Thanks for stopping by. We'll be sure to follow the policy work that Wanda is doing and the policy work of Prison Policy Initiative in general, the kind of research that they're putting out on prisons and jails in the United States. And I'll look to continue to ask her to come back and share what she's doing, because I think she is a fantastic guest to speak with. I'm glad that I was able to share her with listeners of the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast. Again, if you would like to support this show, patreon.com/unauthorized disclosure is the place to go to become a paid member. And you can also go to the dissenter.org and sign up there as well. At the podcast level, you'll get all these shows. You'll get the exclusive content that we post, as well as the full episodes that we share on a regular basis with our subscribers.